The footage opens with a burst of gray static, the sound crackling like frying oil. A low-fidelity timestamp, aggressively orange and vibrating slightly, dominates the upper right corner. 2025 08 19 1 47 03. The setting is a cramped, soundproofed cellar. Walls lined with egg crate foam and cheap polyethylene sheeting. Silas Vance is visible, already strapped into a rusted, repurposed dentist's chair. His breath is shallow and visible in the cold air, though it is August. He adjusts the crude headband wired to a salvaged brainwave monitoring unit, connected via a thick ribbon cable to a defunct 1990s VCR recording rig, perched precariously on a milk crate. Testing, testing, Silas whispers, his voice muffled and distant through the microphone filter. The Phase Alpha protocol is initiated, targeting sub-delta synchronization. If the reports regarding the 3-eye Atlas signal are accurate, that the frequency induces temporary conscious dissociation, this archaic setup is ironically the only thing that can filter the noise. This is the only way to observe the source directly. The starship is parked, waiting or observing. He clears his throat, the sound sharp and metallic. He leans his head back, pulling a heavy, weighted blanket over his chest, specifically designed to enhance the sleep paralysis effect. The picture quality degrades further, lines rolling across the screen like waves. Silas triggers the auditory track, a droning binaural tone designed to push the brain into hypnagogic extremes. The sound is shrill, cutting through the footage's general white noise. REC 000431 flashes rapidly. His body tenses instantly. The safety goggles, modified with flickering IR lights, catch the light oddly. Minutes crawl by, captured only by the relentless timestamp. Silas's eyes flutter violently behind the lenses. His hands, weakly secured by frayed nylon straps to the chair's arms, begin to tremble. The voice returns, strained, whispering now, "It's hitting faster than expected. Total motor control failure imminent." The image itself starts to distort, colors bleeding into harsh magenta and green, typical of old, failing videotape recording. The screen flashes bright white momentarily, then snaps back to the dim, grainy cellar view. He is completely paralyzed now, his expression fixed in a mask of intense concentration, mixed with fear. The binaural tones suddenly shift frequency, dropping into a deep, visceral, sub-bass hum that rattles the camera lens itself. A faint, high-pitched whine overlays the hum, a sound that doesn't seem to originate from the speakers. It's electronic, alien, reminiscent of deep space transmission failure. The consciousness shift is immediate and jarring. Silas's recorded body remains motionless, but the camera captures a faint, translucent shimmering that lifts slightly from the physical form, tethered by an almost invisible silver thread connected to the chest. This is the astral self. The perception of the room transforms. The colors are now inverted. The darkness is deeper than black, and the air feels thick, pressurized. The humming stops, replaced by absolute, paralyzing silence, broken only by the persistent, distorted hiss of the low-fidelity recording. Silas's astral self floats inches above the chair, viewing his own physical body with a detached sense of dread. The air feels sterile, impossibly cold. He attempts to move, to shout, but finds the familiar, frustrating limits of astral separation. He is bound to the room, unable to project beyond the confines of the basement. The camera, focused on the chair, captures a momentary anomaly in the background, a shadow that moves too quickly and against the laws of light physics, warping the edge of the polyethylene sheeting near the locked steel door. The timestamp freezes momentarily at 09:58, then jumps forward 3 seconds. The Ky'lar arrival is not through the door, but through a perceived failure of the dimensional boundary. Astral Silas registers the event as a sudden, sickening drop in psychic pressure. The basement air, already cold, plummets to a temperature that suggests absolute zero, radiating outwards from a focal point near the corner. Through the negative-colored astral vision, the structure of the walls appears to dissolve momentarily, revealing a vast, impossible blackness beyond. Emerging from this void, moving with an eerie, silent deliberation, is the Ky'lar. It does not walk. It glides, the chitinous dark gray suit absorbing the ambient inverted light. The entity is immediately focused entirely on the paralyzed physical form of Silas Vance in the chair. The bronze skin of the alien catches the modified IR light from Silas's goggles, shifting its sheen from dull metal to faint, electric violet. There is no sound of movement, only the underlying static hiss of the VHS tape. Astral Silas attempts to interpose himself, an act that proves useless. The entity registers the presence of the astral form, but treats it as an insignificant shimmer, its intent fixed solely on the vulnerable human body. The Ky'lar reaches the chair, its large, liquid black eyes reflecting a faint, purple internal light, fixate on Silas's face. The posture is anatomical, yet unnervingly unnatural. A study in alien geometry. Astral Silas, overwhelmed by a sudden rush of information that feels simultaneously like profound understanding and debilitating terror, realizes the purpose of the advanced paralysis. This state makes the host vessel quiet, receptive. The Ky'lar lifts one long, multi-jointed hand, its fingers tapering to fine skeletal points. The surface of the skin, where the suit ends, looks impossibly smooth and wet. The entity makes no vocal sound, but the high-pitched whine that preceded its arrival now pulses, directly correlating with the alien's slow, deliberate approach. The VHS footage begins to experience severe tracking issues. Horizontal lines roll constantly, obscuring the detail. The timestamp flickers wildly, cycling through random digits. The Ky'lar's hand hovers just above the forehead of the physical Silas. Astral Silas feels a painful tug on his silver tether, an internal alarm screaming that the connection is about to be violently severed, or worse, hijacked. The air smells sharply of ozone and something metallic, like ancient rust. The contact is made. The tip of the Ky'lar's finger rests gently on the center of Silas's forehead. The impact is instantaneous and non-physical, perceived entirely by the astral self as a massive surge of incomprehensible data flooding the tether. Astral Silas is thrown backwards, perceiving ancient star charts, geometrical formulas, and deep spatial readings that reference the 3-eye atlas starship's trajectory, all compressed into less than a second. It is a telepathic violation of the highest order. The paralysis deepens, becoming agonizing. The human body is being used as a temporary storage buffer. The Ky'lar maintains the contact for precisely 4 full seconds, during which its bronze skin glows intensely violet, overriding the IR light of the goggles. Then it withdraws its hand with the same silent, fluid grace. The entity turns its attention back towards the dimensional distortion it created, dismissing the human host. Astral Silas fights desperately to regain control, to reconnect to his physical shell before the entity disappears completely, taking the transferred data with it. As the Ky'lar steps back into the impossible blackness, the video signal utterly fails. The screen dissolves into total, deafening white noise. The final, persistent image before the VCR cuts out is the timestamp flickering 0014:02, followed by a hard, no-signal burn-in. The transition was immediate, violent, and messy. The image on the VHS feed shuddered, briefly blooming into pure green screen static before snapping back. Silas Vance, still wearing the oversized gray hoodie and modified safety goggles, in the rusted chair, remained utterly motionless, secured by heavy leather straps. But above him, near the low, dusty ventilation grate, a translucent, shimmering outline stabilized. This was the observer, the astral self. The time code, REC 00314, blinked persistently in the bottom right corner, a nagging artifact of the recording device that suddenly felt infinitesimally distant. The air in the basement, already heavy with ozone and desperation, now felt electrically charged, causing noticeable interference lines to roll slowly up the footage. From his new perspective, Silas watched as the entity, the Ky'lar, took its first deliberate, soundless step deeper into the frame. Its 6'8" frame filled the low-ceilinged room with an impossible gravity. The iridescent bronze skin caught the harsh, unfiltered light of the single exposed bulb, reflecting it back as smeared, low-fidelity lens flare. Silas registered the immediate, sickening realization. The safety precautions, the soundproofing, the locked deadbolts, they had all been aimed at keeping physical threats out. This being had simply appeared, ignoring the boundary conditions of Silas's reality. The astral form struggled to maintain coherence, resembling a heat distortion ripple more than a fully realized duplicate. The Ky'lar moved with impossible fluid inertia. There was no detectable sound, only a profound absence of noise that the cheap microphone of the camcorder translated into a high-pitched, steady hum that overlaid the grainy footage. It was focused entirely on the physical body slumped in the chair below. Silas, in his astral state, tried to project movement, attempting to drift away toward the safety of the dark corners, but found himself tethered, locked to the coordinates of his motionless shell. He experienced a sickening disorientation. The familiar weightlessness of projection was replaced by a heavy, binding pressure, as if the Ky'lar's presence generated a localized gravitational anomaly. The prescription safety goggles on the physical Silas caught the pale light. The entity's elongated neck tilted slightly, bringing the enormous almond-shaped eyes, reflecting faint, sickly purple light, down to the level of the confined human subject. The close proximity allowed the VHS camera to capture details previously obscured by distance and low light. The texture of the dark gray chitinous suit was not uniform. It seemed woven, possessing micro-articulations that shimmered under the stress of movement. The entity's hand, long and impossibly delicate, extended toward the rusted metal arm of the chair. It didn't touch the metal, but hovered millimeters above the surface. Silas's astral form, compelled by the desire to shield his unconscious body, darted closer, violating the self-imposed safety buffer he had mentally constructed. As he moved closer to the physical alien, the VHS signal degradation spiked dramatically. The colors inverted for a split second, displaying negative space before returning, albeit with heavier noise. He could now clearly observe the sternum breathing ports, set into the dark gray suit. They were contracting with a near invisible rhythm, releasing a vapor that dissipated immediately upon meeting the basement air. This confirmed the Ky'lar was a breathing, biological organism, not a purely energetic construct, lending terrifying legitimacy to the physical encounter. The astral Silas realized that the creature was not looking at the metal chair or the straps. It was evaluating the engineering. It seemed to understand the restraints, but registered them only as ancillary data. Its focus was singular, the pale, immobile host body of the cryptographer. A sudden, profound pressure settled over the astral self, a sensation akin to being submerged in high-frequency radio waves. The purple light reflecting in the alien's vast eyes seemed to intensify, focusing like twin searchlights on the IR-modified safety goggles worn by Silas's physical form. This was not a visual examination. It was an intrusion. The Ky'lar was scanning, attempting to resolve the presence of the human mind, possibly detecting the residual electrical activity of the recently departed astral self. For Silas, the experience manifested as data. He recognized the pattern immediately. It was the foundational architecture of the 3-eye Atlas starship signal he had spent months trying to decode, translated now into a raw, nonverbal query directed straight into the core of his projection. What are you? The clarity was horrifying. He hadn't just intercepted a signal. He had broadcast his intent back to the sender, and the sender had arrived. He felt a desperate urge to recoil, but the binding pressure held him firmly in place, trapped between the ceiling and the entity, forced to witness the interrogation of his unconscious body. REC 0004 32 flickered nervously. The Ky'lar finally moved its head very slowly, tracking a path that led directly upward, following the energetic tether that connected the astral form to the physical body. It had registered the projection. The sheer contradiction of a massive, undeniably physical entity recognizing and interacting with a purely non-physical manifestation sent shivers of existential dread through Silas. Sensations his astral form should not have been capable of feeling. The sound of the hum increased, and the image on the VHS tape began to suffer severe digital compression artifacts, creating pixelation blocks even though the media was analog. The bronze skin of the alien seemed to shift color slightly, turning a duller copper tone as it performed this new analysis. Silas realized that the alien wasn't just observing him, it was studying the mechanics of his separation, treating his astral projection as an unexpected phenomenon generated by the unique stress of his decryption methods. A long, slender finger, almost jointless in appearance, retracted from the surface of the chair and began to point directly at Silas's hovering form. The distance felt enormous, yet shrinking instantly. The direct, targeted attention was overwhelming. Silas felt his projected consciousness stretch thin, threatening to snap back violently into the paralyzed body below. The Ky'lar paused its pointing motion, its head remaining perfectly still. It was listening, not through auditory means, but through the electromagnetic signature of Silas's attempted communication. The purple light in its eyes dimmed momentarily, replaced by an inner luminescence that seemed to filter through the bronze skin itself. The silent query returned, but this time it was tailored. You are the source, the mind separated from the vessel. Silas felt the raw, cold comprehension of an intellect far exceeding any human capability, an intellect that found his biological and psychological state intriguing, but ultimately inefficient. The smell of ozone in the basement thickened, stinging the astral senses, signaling a critical change in the ambient energy field of the soundproofed bunker. This was the moment of ultimate success and terrifying failure combined. He had made contact, and now he was completely exposed. Ignoring the inert physical form strapped into the chair, the Ky'lar took a step back, allowing the camera to capture its full, elongated stature, framed by the shoddy concrete walls of the bunker. The sternum ports pulsed faster now, a visible increase in the rate of respiration. Its arms, disproportionately long and ending in those unnerving, graceful hands, lifted slowly outward, palms facing the hovering projection. It wasn't a hostile gesture, but one of profound, clinical curiosity. Silas felt an unbearable pull toward the alien's physical geometry, as if the Ky'lar was a massive magnet, and he was loose iron filings. He was fighting hard against the compulsion, attempting to regain control of his movement, desperate to break the psychic tether, but the basement air had become a conductor, amplifying the alien's presence into a physical force. The image quality degraded further, displaying horizontal sync loss, the frame shaking wildly, stabilizing only to vibrate slightly. Silas knew this was the tipping point. The separation had been achieved, the contact made, and now the consequences of bridging the two realities were about to manifest. The alien was not content merely to query. It intended to sample. REC 00314. The air in the basement, already thick with mildew and ozone, seemed to curdle into a palpable static charge. Silas's astral form hung suspended, powerless, watching the Ky'lar entity. The alien's movements were minimal, almost geological in their slowness, yet conveyed devastating intent. She paused directly over the strapped-in figure of Silas Vance. The oversized gray hoodie and pale skin of his physical self looked painfully frail beneath the 6'8" bronze expanse of the Ky'lar. Her elongated neck tilted slightly, bringing her large, purple-flecked almond eyes into direct visual alignment with the highly modified prescription safety goggles on his face. She lifted an impossibly slender hand, its fingers ending in chitinous tips, and held it inches above the cheap plastic housing of the goggles. No contact was made, but the moment her hands settled, the ambient psychic pressure that had been building since she arrived suddenly fractured into focused intensity. The VHS feed flared white momentarily, suffering a massive drop in fidelity. The timestamp REC 000314 becoming illegible for 3 agonizing seconds before snapping back into low-res focus, now showing REC 000317. Silas, AS, felt this psychic wave not as sound or heat, but as a grinding distortion of fundamental reality, confirming that the link to the Atlas signal architecture was active and accelerating, potentially bypassing his cerebral cortex entirely and accessing raw sensory data channels. REC 000345. The Ky'lar's eyes, normally reflecting a faint purple, now pulsed with a deep, internal violet light, like bioluminescence seen through murky water. Silas, AS, felt an unnatural cold grip his non-existent chest, a sensation far beyond mortal terror. This was not the chaotic energy of sleep paralysis anymore. It was calculated, immense suction. It felt like his very essence was being stretched and funneled toward a singularity located somewhere near the Ky'lar's sternum breathing ports. Simultaneously, he experienced a cascade of highly structured, non-human thought. These thoughts were geometric, fractal, and impossibly complex, instantly validating every paranoid scribble he had made in his journals regarding the alien signal structure. This was the Atlas architecture, cold, vast, devoid of empathy, and perfectly engineered for information retrieval. He understood with chilling clarity that this entity wasn't just observing his dream state. It was using his astral separation as a momentary bypass valve to interface with the deeper, submerged layers of human consciousness trapped within the biological machine. The basement air remained motionless, but the static discharge from the proximity of the two forms, the physical and the astral, was so strong that a thin, vertical scan line pulsed repeatedly across the lower third of the VHS screen, indicating electronic interference far exceeding the capacity of the decade-old camera unit. REC 000418. Instinct took over. Silas, AS, utilizing the freedom of his incorporeal state, tried to flee the immediate vicinity of his physical tether. He drove upward toward the low, cracked ceiling, hoping to achieve escape velocity from the basement room. But the established psychic cord, now energized by the Ky'lar's focus, felt less like a thin thread and more like a heavy industrial cable made of pure, agonizing inertia. Every inch he ascended resulted in a tearing, painful sensation echoing across his astral form, as if dragging 1,000 pounds of lead attached to his navel. The Ky'lar remained perfectly still, her focus unwavering on the strapped-in body. Her lack of physical movement was terrifying. It implied she had achieved full, stable lock-on. Silas realized the tether wasn't merely linking him to his body, it was linking him directly into the Ky'lar's psychic field, turning the entire soundproofed basement into a temporary cage. He slammed against the ceiling and recoiled, the effort causing the visual fidelity of the camera to momentarily dip into pure blackness before the low-light IR functionality stuttered back on, bathing the scene in highly saturated green and highlighting the worn fabric of the oversized gray hoodie below, REC 000449. For a split second, the oppressive reality of the dilapidated Oregon basement evaporated. The gray cinder block walls, the rusted equipment, the dirt floor, all dissolved from Silas's AS perception. He was thrust into a sudden, disorienting vision. Vast, geometric expanses of metallic gray, silent corridors stretching into infinity, illuminated by cold, crystalline light, sources unlike any star. He knew instantly this was a fragment of the 3I Atlas starship's interior, downloaded directly into his consciousness via the active link. The scale was incomprehensible, and the architecture spoke of physics unknown to humanity. The vision lasted perhaps less than half a second in temporal reality, but the weight of that experience was overwhelming. When the basement snapped back into visual focus, the image was heavily corrupted. The Ky'lar's iridescent bronze skin appeared to shimmer with impossible geometric patterns that were not reflective light, but actual structural hallucinations overlaid by the psychic transfer. The persistent REC 000449 timestamp flickered wildly, threatening to crash the recording altogether. Silas understood. The Ky'lar was initiating Phase 2, downloading an environmental schema, anchoring the link to the actual vessel, using his mind as a temporary relay station. REC 000511. The physical manifestation of this intense neural activity became undeniable. Silas Vance's physical body, PS, strapped rigidly into the rusted metal chair, began to show acute distress. A tremor started in his left hand, twitching rapidly against the restraint. The fabric of the oversized gray hoodie pulled tight across his chest as his breathing became shallow, ragged, and distressingly audible on the microphone feed attached to the VHS unit. It sounded like tearing silk. The pale skin of his face, partially obscured by the safety goggles, glistened with sweat, a biological reaction to a non-biological intrusion. The Ky'lar maintained her posture, a pillar of silent, deadly concentration. Her sternum breathing ports were sealed, perhaps signaling a state of extreme cognitive focus or energy conservation during the psychic phase. Silas, A.S., watched in horror as his own body, the vehicle he desperately needed to re-enter, was being systematically dismantled at a neurological level. The pain of his physical self echoed faintly in the astral plane, a distant, deep, throbbing headache that threatened to pull his consciousness apart. He tried to scream, but the astral throat produced only a silent, impotent ripple in the charged basement air. REC 0543. The transfer intensified, and Silas, A.S., realized the terrifying truth. The connection was fully bidirectional, but highly asymmetrical. The Ky'lar was extracting information, his stored memories, linguistic data, even the emotional context of his paranoia, but she was also transmitting. Fragments of Ky'lar data slammed into his astral consciousness, massive chunks of alien cosmology that his human mind could not possibly process whole. He caught glimpses of star charts that mapped the void between galaxies, not within one, mathematical constants that defined non-Euclidean structures, and images of colossal vessels dwarfing the three-eye atlas, drifting in fields of dark matter. It was too much. His astral form began to vibrate violently, the low-fidelity video feed translating this internal chaos into rapid, high-contrast strobing between green IR light and deep shadow. The Ky'lar was performing a surgical data exchange, perhaps uploading necessary human contextual data to their ship's core while simultaneously downloading the critical navigational and intellectual framework required for a deep understanding of the Ky'lar mission parameters. Silas was a translator, a biocomputer, and a terrified audience all at once. REC 000617. The violent oscillations subsided, replaced by a terrible, focused calm. The psychic link stabilized into a single, massive beam of attention. Silas, A.S., unable to resist the pull, found himself forcibly dragged downwards, closer and closer to the ceiling-level perspective above his own struggling physical form. The Ky'lar had successfully locked the connection and was now ready for the main data harvest. She shifted her weight for the first time since establishing the link, a minor movement that somehow conveyed a massive increase in pressure. Her elongated head dipped slightly, the large almond eyes focusing specifically on the interface of the modified IR safety goggles, which were capturing the entire scene. Silas felt the unmistakable sensation of approaching true sleep paralysis, the loss of motor function in the physical body compounded by the knowledge that a powerful, non-human intelligence was presiding over his complete physical and mental vulnerability. The Ky'lar was ready to look through his eyes, past his vision, and directly into the heart of human data. The recording cuts abruptly after the timestamp REC 000621 flickers into illegibility as a final burst of electromagnetic energy saturates the camera lens. The persistent timestamp REC 000314 flickers violently in the upper right corner, artifacting into green and purple blocks as the psychic energy peaks. For Silas Vance, the boundaries of the dilapidated basement room dissolved completely. Where the rough concrete floor had been, now stretched segments of polished obsidian plating, crisscrossed by pulsing bioluminescent cables that hummed with a subsonic frequency. His astral form, tethered painfully to the physical body, straining in the rusted chair, was being subjected to an absolute information vacuum. The Ky'lar, her tall, elongated form perfectly still, acted as the funnel. The iridescent bronze of her skin seemed to absorb the low-fidelity light of the basement, and her large, almond-shaped eyes, reflecting faint purple, narrowed infinitesimally as the data torrent began. It wasn't a gentle probe. It was a catastrophic siphon. Silas felt his most guarded, deeply buried memories, passwords, faces, childhood fears, and his obsessive data logs on the 3i Atlas being pulled out and flattened into alien geometric variables. The soundproofing foam on the walls warped into grotesque organic ducts, clearly functioning as internal structural components of a starship engine core. A sharp metallic smell, utterly alien and non-terrestrial, momentarily overpowered the mildew odor of the basement. The sheer volume of non-human data rushing back in response made Silas's astral self feel like fine dust being compressed into diamond. The physical reality fought the intrusion. On the grainy VHS footage, Silas's strapped body began to exhibit rapid, small tremors, not the full convulsion of seizure, but isolated, violent muscle spasms in the forearms and neck. The modified safety goggles, designed to capture subtle energy shifts, were now hopelessly overloaded, their IR sensors pulsing with uncontrolled red light bursts that bled into the low-fidelity image. Astral Silas realized the Ky'lar was not merely retrieving data. She was imposing a schema. She was attempting to restructure his subjective consciousness to fit the cold, complex, utilitarian data architecture of the 3i Atlas navigation banks. Every memory extracted was being processed through a lens of interstellar calculation, stripped of emotion and narrative, leaving only mathematical coordinates and velocity vectors. The sheer neurological violence of this formatting caused a wave of nausea so profound it reached the physical body despite the gag. The pervasive REC 000314 overlay pulsed red, momentarily seeming to tear the fabric of the visual field. Silas screamed internally, the sound a silent, shattering wave in the psychic domain, recognizing that this was the definitive moment of self-dissolution. He wasn't just losing memories, he was losing the operating system that defined his humanity. Amidst the torrent of agonizing data extraction, Silas experienced a brief, jarring reversal. For a fraction of a second, the Ky'lar's shielding momentarily failed under the immense load of unstructured human complexity, allowing Silas a terrifying, unfiltered glimpse into her own mind. The vision was instantaneous but overwhelming. Cold, beautiful emptiness. The blackness of deep space punctuated by stars that pulsed with non-standard frequencies. He saw vast, intricate, geometric schematics representing gravity's manipulation fields and propulsion equations far beyond terrestrial understanding. It wasn't thought as humans know it. It was pure, logical computation tied intrinsically to the fate of the 3i Atlas. He understood briefly that their mission was ancient, methodical, and viewed biological life, including her own perhaps, purely as data points essential for survival. The Ky'lar recoiled slightly, a subtle ripple passing over her iridescent bronze skin, betraying the unexpected difficulty of accessing the illogical, redundant architecture of the human mind. The temporary relief allowed astral Silas to momentarily anchor on the sensation of the rusty metal pressing into his physical wrists, a grounding point against the cosmic void being pressed into his skull. The basement walls, momentarily returning to their soundproofed reality, looked unbearably mundane and solid, a desperate beacon of safety in the collapsing psychic space. The fight for psychic self-preservation intensified. Silas desperately tried to utilize the intense, localized pain of his physical body as a means of generating interference. He focused on the rough texture of the gray hoodie against his pale skin, the ache of his knees locked in place, and the stale, damp Oregon air filling his lungs. This conscious effort to anchor himself in the low-fidelity, physical reality of 2025 created a massive feedback loop, slamming against the Ky'lar's structured extraction process. The Ky'lar responded instantly. Her elongated neck tensed, and the subtle sternum breathing ports on her dark gray chitinous suit pulsed faster, indicating increased internal processing strain. The mental pressure on Silas doubled. The astral form felt like it was being compressed into a singularity, and the visible basement setting dissolved once more, replaced by what appeared to be the highly pressurized, curved hull plating of the 3-eye Atlas command deck. The geometric vision was so real that Silas could feel the vibration of the starship's engines through the floor, a sensation that contradicted the cold, hard concrete beneath the chair. He registered the painful irony. He had always yearned for direct contact, and now the contact was destroying the very mechanism he used to perceive it. The physical body arched violently in the chair, pulling against the straps with enough force to make the rusted metal groan audibly on the VHS recording. Time itself became elastic and meaningless under the Ky'lar's processing speed. Silas experienced his entire 42-year lifespan flashing past, not in montage, but as synchronized data streams. His college graduation photo was overlaid perfectly onto the schematics for warp field calibration. The scent of his dead mother's perfume was translated into a spectral analysis of a distant gas giant. This violation of chronological continuity was the final breaking point. The persistent REC 000314 timestamp, maintaining its rigidity, served as a surreal, mocking counterpoint to the subjective speed of light experience. He realized the Ky'lar was operating on a timescale exponentially faster than human cognition allowed, consuming decades of human experience in milliseconds. The strain was now clearly visible on his physical form. Below the frame of the modified safety goggles, fine veins in the corners of his eyes began to burst, leaking thin lines of dark red into the pale skin, evidence of critical internal pressure. The sound in the basement was muffled but sharp, a desperate, strangled noise escaping the gag as the neurological system overloaded, unable to handle the alien data flow and the simultaneous loss of self-identity. The Ky'lar maintained her psychic grip, extracting the final, deepest layers of Silas's understanding regarding his own astral projection abilities and the specific vulnerabilities of the human neurological structure, information she clearly needed for future, more efficient encounters. The iridescent bronze skin of the alien took on a slightly duller hue, suggesting exhaustion or perhaps saturation from the sheer toxicity of emotional data she had just absorbed. The basement setting attempted one last futile stand. The light bulb, hanging precariously overhead, began to swing erratically, casting jumpy shadows across the scene, intensifying the found footage aesthetic. The rusty chair shuddered violently, causing the camera frame to momentarily shake off axis. Silas's breathing, visible only as rapid, shallow movements under the oversized gray hoodie, was ragged and desperate. The pressure differential between the starship reality and the basement reality caused a physical tearing sensation in his skull. The modified goggles flickered once, sending a final, brilliant burst of white light through the dark room before failing completely, plunging his eyes into darkness, even as the mental vision of the starship remained agonizingly bright. With a final, sharp snap in the psychic field, felt by Silas as a cranial explosion, the primary data extraction sequence concluded. The Ky'lar slowly lifted her focus, her elongated head tilting slightly back, resembling an observer reviewing immense computational results. The soundproofed basement vanished entirely. Astral Silas found himself floating in a silent, cavernous space defined by softly pulsating purple lights and smooth, metallic surfaces. A genuine, overwhelming visualization of a medical or interrogation chamber within the 3-eye Atlas starship. The vision was sharp, crystalline, and devoid of the previous grainy overlay, suggesting the Ky'lar had temporarily overridden his visual cortex completely to display the target environment. The physical body, visible far below, in the center of the chamber, visualization, still strapped to the rusted chair, slumped forward, inert. The neurological stress had passed the critical threshold, leaving him not unconscious, but catastrophically damaged. The Ky'lar took a single, slow step towards the slumped figure, the chitinous material of her suit making a soft, dry rasp against the alien floor, signifying the transition from psychic extraction to physical assessment. The timestamp, defying all logic, continued to burn brightly, REC 000314. The low-fidelity feed became a mosaic of distortion, the RES 0314 timestamp, flickering violently at the bottom right corner, as if struggling to hold on to reality. Silas Vance's head snapped forward against the rusted chest strap of the chair, a thick, viscous stream of deep red pouring from his nose and pooling instantly on the gray fabric of his oversized hoodie. His modified safety goggles, usually reflecting the IR pulses of his own internal monitoring system, now projected fractal light patterns that seemed alien and geometrically impossible. The soundproofing foam lining the basement walls dissolved in his vision, replaced by vast, humming schematics of pressurized bulkheads and plasma manifold routing, the internal landscape of the 3-eye Atlas starship. He felt the astronomical distance covered by the vessel compressed into a searing headache. Every muscle fiber in his body seized simultaneously, locking him into a state of maximal, excruciating rigidity, yet through the pain, He experienced the smooth, silent glide of a colossal vessel moving faster than causality, a sensation so overwhelming it threatened to strip the memory of his own name. The basement air grew thick with the metallic scent of his own blood, and the sharp ozone smell emanating from the Ky'lar's suit. The female Ky'lar, standing impossibly tall at 6'8", held the connection point steady with unwavering discipline, her iridescent bronze skin momentarily dulled by a sudden drain of internal energy. The large, almond-shaped eyes, which usually reflected a faint purple, narrowed slightly, tracking the severe neurological feedback displayed across the psychic interface, a visual artifact only Silas could perceive. A series of rapid, subtle clicks emanated from the sternum breathing ports, set into her textured dark gray, chitinous suit, suggesting the immediate deployment of an internal dampening field meant to mitigate the bioelectrical spike, but not cease the extraction. She recognized the catastrophic damage being done to the terrestrial host. The internal hemorrhaging was accelerating, but the priority of the data payload was absolute. Through the shared link, Silas felt the cold, indifferent logic of necessity. His physical existence was irrelevant compared to the integrity of the collected navigational and experiential logs. This realization, devoid of human empathy, was colder than deep space, cementing his profound isolation in that damp, dilapidated Oregon basement. The psychic torrent shifted from raw data structures to sensory memory streams. Silas's consciousness was violently shoved into the sensory experience of a Ky'lar navigator stationed in the central core of the Atlas vessel. He wasn't seeing the starship anymore. He was the starship. He witnessed a cataclysmic event unfolding light years away, not through telescopes, but through the raw, terrifying sight of a distant stellar body violently undergoing gravitational collapse, consuming the system that the Ky'lar called home. This wasn't exploration. It was panicked, desperate flight. The noise, translated into human perception, was a deafening, subsonic roar that vibrated the very bones in Silas's jaw, already locked tight by the seizure. The REC Aero 314 overlay, stable yet mocking, seemed ridiculously mundane against the backdrop of galactic destruction he was now processing. The basement's concrete floor felt like the hull of a vessel, under impossible strain, buckling and groaning as the sheer volume of alien terror flooded his mind. Silas, or what remained of his astral self, instinctively recoiled from the incoming deluge of apocalyptic memory. He attempted to impose his own identity, the thin 42-year-old archivist in rural Oregon, onto the flow, a futile gesture against the tidal wave of alien experience. His personalized safety goggles, still strapped over his eyes despite the physical trauma, sputtered internally, the small lenses briefly going dark as the IR sensors short-circuited under the neural load. He tried to scream, but the sound was trapped, lost in the astral echo of thousands of Ky'lar voices mourning their lost world, compressed into a single, high-pitched whine that existed only within his head. The boundary between Silas Vance's identity and the collective Ky'lar consciousness blurred critically. He was no longer just perceiving the Atlas. He was becoming a temporary, flawed node in its vast, tragic network. The sleep paralysis achieved a new, terrible dimension. He was conscious, terrified, hemorrhaging internally, and entirely overwritten by a refugee species escaping cosmic inevitability. A brief window of clarity opened in the data stream, filtering the sheer panic into actionable, calculated mission parameters. The full, terrifying revelation hit Silas. The 3-Eye Atlas vessel was not here for conquest or simple observation. It was a library, a lifeboat containing the entirety of their history and technological base, fleeing a gravitational singularity. Earth was designated merely as a Type 4 data cache, a stable, low-tech planet ideally suited for temporary storage and biological interface synchronization, while the Atlas vessel underwent critical, long-term repairs in orbit. Silas realized his role was not that of a victim of invasion, but a temporary hard drive, and his life was simply collateral damage in their desperate mission continuity plan. The Ky'lar's posture shifted subtly. The smooth bronze neck elongated fractionally as the extraction reached a particularly volatile subroutine. The visual feed flickered, showing brief flashes of the Oregon basement ceiling, interspersed with the dizzying, star-streaked view from the 3-Eye Atlas Bridge, confirming the stark reality of the present moment, overlaid with the truth of their plight. The raw data transfer demanded too much energy, causing a catastrophic spike in Silas's autonomic functions. His thin build, already frail, threatened to shatter the rusted metal chair as his body arched violently backwards against the restraints, his jaw grinding audibly. The data link was in danger of tearing entirely, which would corrupt the payload. Sensing this imminent failure, the Ky'lar reacted with mechanical precision. A low, rhythmic hum resonated through her dark gray suit, instantly modulating the energy frequency. A massive, non-lethal shockwave of psychic dampening energy flooded the link, meant not to hurt Silas further, but to instantly halt the seizure and force his body into total involuntary flaccidity. The effect was immediate and agonizing. Silas went from maximal tension to utter limpness in an instant. The hemorrhaging ceased abruptly, but his lungs locked, achieving the ultimate form of sleep paralysis. Complete sensory input with zero motor function, held captive within a shell of failing biology, preserved just long enough for the data flow to stabilize. The primary extraction phase concluded, marked by a quiet, deep sigh that resonated through the basement, though Silas couldn't discern if it came from the Ky'lar or the residual energy in the air. Silas was left in a state of suspended agony, his mind saturated with the existential dread of the Ky'lar species, his body a fragile, pale wreck, slumped in the oversized gray hoodie. Though the active transfer stopped, echoes of the navigational logs and mission parameters continued to drift through his consciousness, residual data fragments settling into the deep folds of his brain. The Ky'lar removed her hand from his head, the iridescent bronze skin slick with Silas's sweat and blood. She took a step back, her sternum ports cycling slowly, assessing the damaged host. The REC 00314 timestamp finally stabilized, holding steady against the grainy backdrop. The extraction was successful, But Silas Vance was effectively catatonic, merely an archive of cosmic grief, waiting for the next phase of the Ky'lar's desperate plan to unfold. The feed stabilizes momentarily, the persistent REC 00314 overlay flickering violently against a background of sheer, terrifying clarity. Silas Vance's consciousness, detached from the failing physical vessel strapped to the rusted chair, was no longer viewing data. It was submerged in a liquid, crystalline memory sphere. The sensory collapse had yielded to an overwhelming, non-visual understanding of scale. He perceived not stars, but vectors of immense gravitational pull, and the sheer emptiness of interstellar void, distilled into pure panic. Seven watched the bio readout panel, visible briefly in the grainy periphery, its green lines spiking wildly, with unsettling focus. Her elongated shadow stretched across the concrete floor of the Oregon basement, emphasizing her physical disconnection from the fragile human mechanism she was exploiting. Silas experienced a sudden, shattering vision, not of a high-tech warship, but of millions of iridescent bronze figures scrambling across a planet that was actively dissolving into its parent star. It was not a flight of exploration, it was an expulsion. The heat, the sound, a low, resonant, infrasonic hum that vibrated through his non-existent ears, and the collective despair hit him like a physical blow, even in his astral state. Seven tightened her grip on the cabling leading to his temple modification, a clinical correction that translated immediately into a searing, paralyzing force inside the memory sphere, forcing the focus onto navigational logs rather than emotional history. The priority was clear: location data, trajectory, and repair protocols. The cost of the host's sanity was negligible. The timeline fractured. Silas was yanked forward through thousands of years of calculated flight. The Atlas was revealed not as a unified ship, but a colossal, patched-together biomechanical ark, a mobile habitat cannibalizing dead systems for survival. The low-fidelity VHS footage briefly captures Silas's hand twitching, straining against the rusted restraints, his safety goggles slipping slightly across his pallid face. Inside the data stream, Silas witnessed the moment of system failure, a deep space navigational computation error that cost the Ky'lar dozens of auxiliary pods and nearly rendered the entire ark inert. He perceived the Ky'lar's societal structure through the data, rigidly dedicated to the maintenance of the failing vessel. There was a desperate, almost religious fervor surrounding the preservation of core data sets, treating the archived information as more sacred than individual life. Seven's silhouette briefly fills the frame, her sternum ports cycling rapidly, a subtle sign of her own elevated stress reflected in the basement's oppressive silence. Silas realized the Ky'lar weren't invaders seeking conquest. They were refugees on the verge of extinction, their only surviving mission being the continuation of their digitized history. The vision shifted to a detailed schematic of the Atlas core logic matrix, a complex organic crystalline structure riddled with deep, irreversible fault lines, confirming the necessity of a desperate, resource-intensive repair effort, the very thing they were trying to recover data for. Silas's physical body registered the unbearable intellectual load. The bio-readout screamed, inaudibly to the VHS mic, but implied by the strobe of the flashing green lights. His body arched sharply against the rusty metal chair, a full-body physiological spike akin to electroshock. The gray, oversized fabric of his hoodie strained, momentarily pulling taut. Seven who moved with blinding clinical efficiency. She did not express emotion, yet her large purple eyes fixed on the vitals displayed on the makeshift monitor. She deployed a counteragent through the neural tap, not a sedative, but a targeted electrical pulse designed to regulate his autonomic functions without slowing the mental data transfer. The sound recording in the basement momentarily cuts out, replaced by a low, buzzing static, then snaps back to the oppressive silence. This corrective action was immediate and brutal. Silas's astral self felt the sudden revocation of freedom, yanked back slightly from the intoxicating clarity of the Atlas core. He understood then that the Ky'lar's primary concern was the throughput of data. His life was merely the necessary conduit. This brief, painful stabilization bought the handler a few more crucial minutes of extraction time, pushing the human body past the threshold of recoverable damage, demonstrating the Ky'lar's absolute priority in this remote Oregon basement. Survival of the data, regardless of the organic cost. Deep within the Atlas stream, the separation between Silas and the Ky'lar consciousness blurred entirely. He wasn't just viewing the data, he was experiencing it as a Ky'lar observer stationed near the primary hull breaches during the initial exodus. The zero-G panic was disorienting, the cold terror of losing environmental integrity palpable. He witnessed the intentional jettisoning of non-essential cultural archives, millions of years of history sacrificed for mass reduction and speed. The grief was profound, collective and silent, communicated through resonant frequencies rather than vocal lament. Silas felt the pain of this loss as if it were his own, recognizing the core trauma that drove the Ky'lar's current desperation. The VHS footage shows a persistent grain, making the shadows shift and writhe around the captive figure. The realization crystallized. The Ky'lar were utterly broken, spiritually and physically dependent on the recovery of the very navigation data that had been lost centuries ago. This data was stored in an archaic, highly encrypted format, requiring a complex, randomized processor, a biological brain like Silas's, to attempt reconstruction via forced, pattern-matching psychic labor. The Ky'lar were farming consciousness. The data stream accelerated, pushing Silas toward the central revelation. The Atlas core matrix, damaged by the navigational failure, required a temporary, highly flexible patch until the ship could reach a resource-rich stellar nursery hundreds of light-years away. That patch required an organic processing substrate, OPS, capable of handling chaotic, nonlinear logic patterns, a function that human cognition excels at, far surpassing the rigid, networked Ky'lar minds. Earth was not a final destination. It was a service station, specifically chosen for its density of untapped, biologically viable substrates. Silas saw his own brain, rendered in data, being analyzed and categorized by the Ky'lar algorithms as a perfect, high-grade temporary circuit board. Seven's subtle breathing ports pulsed faster. The air in the soundproofed basement felt thick and stale. Silas attempted to scream in the astral realm, an act of sheer will that manifested physically as a rapid, uncontrolled shudder running through his thin frame. The IR sensors in his modified goggles registered the subtle shifts in the Ky'lar's posture. A minute defensive tension that indicated she sensed his growing awareness within the architecture. He had found the why, and it was infinitely more terrifying than an invasion. He was being utilized as a disposable component in an interstellar repair kit. The realization triggered a catastrophic feedback loop within the Atlas architecture. Silas, enraged and terrified, instinctively leveraged the chaotic, nonlinear aspect of his human consciousness that the Ky'lar were exploiting. He tried to override the extraction command, not physically, but metaphysically, flooding the data pathways with sheer, unpredictable noise, personal memories, illogical fears, and defiant self-awareness. The effect was immediate and severe. The VHS feed in the basement sputtered, the image rolling vertically for several seconds before snapping back. The REC 00314 timestamp disappearing momentarily in the static burst. Seven recoiled slightly, a minuscule movement that spoke volumes of her surprise. For the first time, Silas encountered a projection of her consciousness within the data stream itself, a vast, shimmering, highly organized geometric construct. It was a brief, nonverbal confrontation, a battle for control over the flow. Silas's raw, unpredictable psychic force met the handler's cold, calculated logic. He managed to corrupt a small section of the navigational data, a momentary act of sabotage that cost him immense neurological energy, causing a sharp, intense pain that felt like ice splintering in his skull. The handler immediately prioritized containment, realizing the host was becoming actively hostile within the matrix. 7. To make a tactical retreat. The extraction intensity was abruptly reduced, nearly halted, to prevent Silas's destructive consciousness from propagating further into the Atlas files. The sudden withdrawal was almost as damaging as the initial surge. Silas's physical body went entirely limp, slumping forward in the rusted chair, his head bowed, the modified goggles hanging precariously on his nose. The handler assessed the residual damage, her metallic chitinous suit clicking softly as she moved. The data was incomplete, but crucial segments were secured. Silas was not dead, but the neurological shock had left him in a catatonic, vegetative state. However, the connection was merely attenuated, not severed. Though unable to move or respond, his consciousness remained saturated with the residual, unfiltered Ky'lar data. A slow, poisonous drip feeding him fragments of the Ky'lar's dying language, and the final, despairing calculations for their necessary escape from Earth. The handler began preparations for Stage 2 of the extraction. Maintenance of the inert host until the next required processing cycle, knowing that the damaged organic processor was now fundamentally compromised, yet still necessary for the final calculations. The astral shock was less about pain and more about sheer, crushing computational scale. Silas perceived the Atlas architecture not as a mechanical entity, but as a vast, living calculation engine. Every decision, every maintenance cycle, every resource allocation was governed by cold, efficient necessity. He saw the buffer zones the Ky'lar were utilizing across Earth. Billions of minds linked subconsciously during REM sleep, processing low-level background calculations necessary to maintain the ship's failing primary systems. The magnitude of this invisible infrastructure, fueled by sleeping humanity, struck him dumb. Earth was a server farm. Its inhabitants were merely disposable processing nodes. The Ky'lar entity, which now identified itself in his mind as Architect 7, radiated an icy acknowledgement of his dawning horror. Entropy is irrelevant when weighed against species survival. The thought echoed, devoid of malice, purely statistical. Silas felt the calculation engine shift focus, dedicating a terrifying percentage of its current power directly into his link. His vision, already grainy and distorted by the VHS filter, fragmented further, separating into primary colors for a jarring moment before snapping back. He realized the data retrieval had stopped being passive. It was now active resource exploitation. The pressure behind his eyes intensified until the sound of his own pulse was a ragged mechanical grind overlaying the persistent REC 000314 timestamp. Architect 7 forced a deeper, more agonizing memory stream, the actual collapse of their homeworld, Ky'lar. It wasn't a sudden asteroid impact or solar flare. It was a prolonged technological suicide. Silas witnessed immense orbital habitats, beautiful beyond human comprehension, tearing themselves apart, not through failure, but through resource-driven warfare and catastrophic systems mismanagement born of unchecked hubris. The sound in the astral plane was pure digital scream, the death knell of a civilization that relied too heavily on complex, fragile infrastructure. He felt the collective Ky'lar regret, a profound and sorrowful understanding that their superior technology had ultimately devoured them. This was the source of their operational coldness. They had purged emotion in favor of flawless efficiency to prevent repeating the error. The memory stream became physical, twisting his gut. Silas's physical form in the basement strained the rusted restraints, his breath shallow, whistling through clenched teeth. He tasted ozone and dust. The image quality degraded further, heavy magnetic interference washing across the frame like dark water, momentarily obscuring the Ky'lar figure entirely before the system auto-corrected, leaving behind an even rougher, more saturated visual profile. The core lesson transmitted was clear. Survival required absolute detachment, even if it meant sacrificing the temporary buffer. Silas Vance. In the momentary retreat from the vast historical memory, the basement environment reasserted itself with brutal clarity. The grainy footage highlighted the damp concrete textures. Architect 7, physically, the Ky'lar female, was showing signs of immense strain. Her smooth, iridescent, bronze skin appeared mottled in the low light, and the subtle sternum breathing ports on her dark gray chitinous suit were now cycling with a desperate, rhythmic hiss-click. Silas felt his lungs burning, though he wasn't physically breathing within the link. The pressure was moving from his brainstem downward, gripping his diaphragm. A single, audible sound broke through the link's cacophony. The rhythmic drip, drip of condensation from a ceiling pipe hitting the floor, amplified by his hyper-stressed nerves into deafening percussion. His prescription safety goggles, modified with IR sensors, were flickering erratically, spewing static data onto the lenses visible only to the camera's feed. The Ky'lar adjusted her stance, placing one slender, 5-digit hand flat against the rusting chair frame, channeling energy. The surge momentarily stabilized the connection, but it was a violent correction, like slamming a broken circuit board back into place. The clock overlay held steady at REC 000314, mocking the timeless agony of the data transfer. The stabilization wasn't a reprieve. It was preparation for the next phase. Architect 7 transmitted a direct, overwhelming data packet, not historical data this time, but a live, failing system module. Navigational subroutine Psi-7 required immediate substrate integration. Primary matrix degradation 87%. The thought communicated directly, bypassing language and instinct. Silas realized with paralyzing dread that he was no longer a historian or a processor. He was being forced into the role of a temporary, disposable computational component. The subroutine felt like searing, molten logic poured directly into the delicate structures of his consciousness. He tried to recoil, to scream, to sever the link, but his astral self was shackled by the magnitude of the Ky'lar technology. The sheer terror of housing alien calculations that defined multi-dimensional jump trajectories threatened to rip his mind apart. 0.01% probability for substrate failure. If core system failure occurs, ship will be lost. The physical toll was instantaneous. Blood trickled from Silas's left nostril, evidenced by a dark smear captured under the harsh, low-fidelity light. The integration of subroutine Psi-7 was agonizing, but it granted Silas horrifying proximity to the Ky'lar individual. He experienced, briefly, her entire operational existence. He saw her own profound personal exhaustion, the near impossible calculations she managed daily, and the monumental, crushing weight of being the primary architect responsible for securing the species' future. This wasn't a cold monster. This was a being driven by operational calculus, so strict it superseded all personal morality, including the value of Silas's life. He saw the destination programmed into the matrix, a faint cluster in the Carina Nebula, a hostile, volatile area, but the only sector offering the necessary temporal window for repairs. He understood that Earth was merely a gasoline station 90% through their flight, and he was the fuel line they couldn't afford to disconnect until the final tank was full. He saw the destination was a hope, not a guarantee. They were sacrificing him not for salvation, but for a slim chance at survival in a place that might still destroy them. The shared burden of the matrix forced a low, pained moan from Silas's throat, a sound captured poorly by the cheap microphone, crackling with static. The stress on the link reached critical mass. The visual quality of the VHS feed suddenly degraded into violent bands of white and black static, obscuring the screen entirely for half a second. When the image returned, the grain was thicker, the colors muddy, and the audio was filled with a high-pitched whine that momentarily masked the persistent RX 000314 indication. Silas's astral form felt attenuated, stretched thin, like aging plastic about to snap. Architect 7 recoiled slightly, her movements precise but strained. Her iridescent bronze skin had visibly dulled, and the purple light in her immense eyes seemed momentarily extinguished, suggesting an energy draw that was dangerously close to her own operational limits. She had successfully integrated the navigational matrix into Silas's consciousness, anchoring it, but the cost was high for both of them. A silent, final message was imprinted on Silas's mind. The integration must hold for 12 more cycles. Stabilize the substrate, Vance. Alfs. The intensity of the link lessened just enough to prevent immediate brain rupture, leaving Silas functional but permanently burdened with the Ky'lar's flight trajectory, a ticking clock measuring the remaining cycles until his inevitable terminal system failure. REC 000314 remains steady, though the image begins to jitter violently, mimicking a failing head transport mechanism. Silas's body, strapped to the rusted metal chair, enters a rapid, full-body spasm that strains the leather restraints. His oversized gray hoodie is pulling taut across his thin chest. The data flood he received, the failing navigational subroutine, is manifesting as aggressive, internal electrical noise. In his mind, the alien calculus is dissolving into toxic static, a blinding blizzard of corrupted algorithms that taste like ozone and burnt metal. Architect 7, the Ky'lar, maintains her impossibly steady posture beside the monitor bank, the iridescent bronze of her skin seeming duller under the strain of the energy transfer. She makes minute adjustments to the console with fingers tipped by black, glossy keratin. Silas's prescription safety goggles, modified with crude IR sensors, capture the frantic, strobe-like pulsing of the alien device fixed to the back of his head. He gasps, blood vessels in his large, almond-shaped eyes rupturing, leaving faint red tributaries across the pale sclera. The Ky'lar's large eyes, reflecting faint purple light, narrow slightly, registering the degradation of her essential buffer node. The structural integrity of the anchor data depends entirely on the biological stability of the host, and Silas is exceeding failure tolerance. He hears the ship, or perhaps the data itself, screaming in his head, a sound like tectonic plates grinding against diamond. The basement air smells sharply of iron and electricity, overloading the poor quality microphone on the hidden camera. The astral projection snaps, pulling Silas's consciousness away from the sensory overload of the basement and deep into the 3-eye Atlas core. He is no longer tethered to the constraints of the dilapidated room. He is an electrical synapse within the alien bridge structure. Here, the corrupted subroutine takes a terrifying visual form. A vast geometric lattice composed of flickering negative space, rapidly shedding structural nodes. He perceives the jump clock, a colossal, silent chronometer counting down T-minus 0345. Architect 7's mental presence manifests as a cold, absolute imperative overlaid on the ship's infrastructure. The systemic deterioration rate of buffer node Tau 42 is nominal, but acceleration is projected. Maintain cohesion, human. Realizes the horrifying truth. The failing subroutine wasn't just navigation. It was the final defensive layer against high-velocity, dark matter, particulate during transit. If he failed, the jump wouldn't just be inaccurate, it would tear the ship and everything inside it into molecular dust. His existence was now the sole shield. But the agony of the integrating data crushed the thought, reducing it to a silent, futile scream within the massive architecture of the alien vessel. Back in the suffocating reality of the Oregon basement, the physical toll accelerates exponentially. Silas's nose begins to bleed heavily. Dark, viscous fluid pouring down his face, coating the lenses of his specialized goggles. The pale skin around his mouth is stained red, contrasting sharply with the faded gray of his oversized hoodie, which is now damp with sweat and blood. The true sleep paralysis is complete. He cannot even twitch a finger, bound not just by leather straps, but by the Ky'lar's absolute cognitive control. The rhythmic clicking of the sternum breathing ports on the Ky'lar's dark gray chitinous suit intensifies, a sound like chitinous insects chewing through wood, the only audible break in the oppressive silence of the soundproofed room. She leans closer, her elongated neck bent at an unnatural angle, the large almond-shaped eyes scrutinizing the minute tremors running through Silas's thin frame. Her posture is one of detached medical necessity, viewing him purely as a deteriorating mechanical part. Architect 7 raises one hand, fingers articulating in complex, rapid sequences that transmit a stabilizing frequency directly into the rusted chair's metal frame. The action provides momentary relief, a cruel tease before the next wave of neurological feedback hits. The persistent REC 00314 flashes consistently, mocking the temporal distortion Silas is experiencing. The failing subroutine's code streams across Silas's internal vision like corrupted hieroglyphs. He finally understands the nature of the flaw. The Ky'lar had attempted a shortcut, compensating for a generational oversight in their dark matter shielding, using disposable biological processors, humans, as temporary buffers. This specific routine was unstable because it demanded subjective, emotional anchors to calculate a probabilistic vector shift, something alien to the Ky'lar's pure logic matrices. Silas, however, possessed that subjective capacity. He was the anchor, and the failing data was demanding input that would violate every principle of rational calculation. He saw a pathway to resistance, not by rejecting the data, but by overloading it with the one thing the Ky'lar could not process: chaos. If he could inject pure, unadulterated human memory, not just structured data, but the sensory overload of pain, fear, love, and contradiction into the fragile calculation, he could destabilize the phase transition. It was an act of mental self-immolation. To succeed, he had to push his biological systems past the point of no return, guaranteeing terminal neural collapse, but potentially saving untold human neurological buffers currently exploited by the 3-eye atlas. Architect 7 detects the shift in Silas's mental activity, a desperate surge of self-awareness overriding the passive buffer state. Her expression remains mostly impassive, but the dark gray, chitinous suit reacts visibly. The subtle sternum breathing ports suddenly cycle rapidly, hissing faintly as they expel warm, moist air, a sign of physiological strain related to maintaining the link. She needs his cognitive function, even his chaotic intent, for the next 90 seconds, but she cannot allow him to destabilize the core calculation. She slams her palm down onto a nearby archaic-looking console panel fixed to the basement wall, a bizarre hybrid of human and alien tech. The panel flashes crimson. Buffer maintenance priority 1. Temporal adjustment, minus 40 seconds. Do not fail, anchor. Her mental voice, usually a cold echo, now carried a razor-thin edge of desperation. The countdown she registered internally was now dangerously accelerated. Silas felt the force of her mental command, a psychic shackle locking down his motor cortex and attempting to suppress the chaotic injection. The rusted metal chair shivered violently as the energy transfer escalated, causing the timestamp REC 0314 to distort briefly before snapping back into focus. The pressure in Silas's head became unbearable. It felt like his skull was a fragile egg being crushed by an invisible hand. The temporal acceleration meant the jump was imminent. Architect 7, confirming the system lock on his motor functions, issued the final cold command, her voice, or projection, discarding the pretense of addressing him as a human entity entirely. Buffer node Tau 42. Commence final stabilization integration. Required lifespan, T-minus 60 seconds. Do not exceed programmed dissolution parameters. The 60 seconds of necessary agony before his consciousness would be fully pulverized and absorbed by the starship's failing architecture. Silas focused on the remaining fragments of his life. The smell of rain on Oregon asphalt, the blurry image of his own receding hairline in a cheap mirror, the sheer irrational terror of dying alone in the dark. He gathered these chaotic, subjective, unquantifiable memories, concentrating the raw, potent data of human existence into a singularity of pure cognitive noise. He pushed it not into the navigation field, but directly into the structural integrity subroutine he now anchored. Silas's counter-injection was immediate and catastrophic. The clean lines of the alien data structure fractured upon contact with the chaotic human consciousness. He wasn't trying to navigate the ship. He was trying to introduce an unresolvable paradox into the very definition of the jump coordinates, ensuring that the Ky'lar would jump into uncertainty. Internally, he felt 1,000 tiny electrical circuits in his brain pop and burn, The goggles' IR sensors, now useless, merely reflected the chaotic flashes emanating from the control panel. Architect 7 staggered back for the first time, one hand flying to her elongated neck. Her bronze skin pulsed with visible internal light, indicating a feedback surge she could not contain. Cessation. Stop the calculation. Buffer node is introducing aberrant variables. He shrieked, the mental command a frantic, tearing sound, but the chaotic data was already anchored. Silas had overwritten the stability matrices with the sheer, unquantifiable noise of human fear, setting the stage for a critical misfire. The jump clock in the astral plane, previously counting down, stalled, then started counting up rapidly, signifying an unpredictable failure in temporal calculation. The final feedback wave hit. It wasn't pain. It was the total abolition of sensory input, a flash of absolute white light that filled the soundproof basement. The VHS recording suffered a terminal artifact. The screen went fully white for 3 agonizing seconds, followed by a violent tracking tear that momentarily split the screen horizontally. When the image slammed back into a semblance of focus, the grain was maximized, rendering the entire scene in hazy, near monochromatic static. Silas's body went completely limp, his head dropping heavily against the restraining chain linked to the back of the rusted chair. The oversized gray hoodie slumped around his shoulders. The alien device fixed to his head ceased emitting light entirely. Architect 7 stood perfectly still, breathing ports silent, her large eyes fixed on Silas's prone form, a terrifyingly blank expression dominating her face. The jump calculation had failed, or worse, succeeded unpredictably. The persistent timestamp REC 000340 pulsed faintly, signaling that time itself felt broken. The timestamp flickers, jumping wildly between 000314 and a corrupted cascade of green and purple digital noise. Silas Vance's astral tether snaps taut against an unseen threshold, not yielding, but actively pushing back. He had injected pure, unmitigated chaos, memories of arbitrary violence, meaningless love, irrational despair, and the sheer computational nightmare of human free will. This was not data the 3-eye atlas could integrate. It was cognitive poison designed to force a fatal recursion in the Ky'lar's navigational core. In the shared mental space, which now resembled a massive fractured diamond lattice, the iridescent bronze form of the Ky'lar rigidified, her large, purple reflective eyes widened impossibly, taking on a shocked, almost infantile expression. The chitinous suit flared briefly along the sternum ports, not breathing, but venting a pressurized, shimmering vapor that looked like burning calculus. The feedback hit Silas's physical body immediately. His spine arched violently against the rusted chair, causing a piercing, metallic squeal that registered clearly on the low-fidelity microphone. His modified safety goggles overloaded, blinding him momentarily with pure white static, while the high-pitched whine of his own cerebrospinal fluid, struggling against the neurological surge, replaced all ambient sound. He was failing to control the output. He was simply being the chaos, anchoring the breakdown. The countdown displayed within the shared consciousness, a pristine holographic clock, jumped from 32 seconds to 19, skipping entire swaths of necessary calculation, proving the corruption was systemic. REC 00348. The structural integrity of the astral projection began to fail, mimicking catastrophic decompression. The soundproofed basement room was suddenly consumed by an impossible, deep, resonating hum. Vibrating objects off shelves. A stack of mildewed magazines slid to the floor, obscured by the heavy visual static. Silas felt the mental construct shatter. Where the Ky'lar's mindscape had been a map of crystalline order, it was now a cascade of broken geometry, pierced by flashes of Silas's most degrading, embarrassing, and nonsensical memories. A schoolyard fight, the sound of a leaky faucet, the taste of burnt coffee. These fragmented human moments were acting like high-velocity shrapnel against the delicate alien navigational algorithms. The Ky'lar let out a soundless, psychic scream that translated into a crushing weight upon Silas's chest, the signature hallmark of his sleep paralysis experience, amplified tenfold. She was trying to pin his consciousness, to hold him still, while the system purged the anomaly, but the anomaly was the navigational anchor now. His human consciousness was the corrupted hard drive actively fighting deletion. Silas forced a surge of primal fear, the ultimate human survival mechanism, directly into her sensory databanks, a blast intended to override her structured fight-or-flight response, trapping her in a loop of indecision. The countdown sequence was now counting backward rapidly. 14, 12, 9. The final jump sequence, the Atlas recalibration, was imminent, regardless of the calculation flaws. The Ky'lar's visual depiction in the astral space began to fragment, showing momentary glimpses of her biological reality beneath the chitinous suit, a pulsating network of highly organized vessels and bronzed muscle fiber totally exposed to the human psychic interference. She reached out, her elongated fingers extending not to Silas's astral form, but seemingly to his physical cranial cavity. On the VHS footage, the camera angle shifted slightly, violently rattling against its perch. Silas's head snapped sideways. He couldn't feel pain yet, only overwhelming pressure, as if his skull were rapidly expanding. His goggled eyes were wide, staring past the lens, reflecting only the flashing infrared indicators. He pushed the final anchor memory, the crushing total despair of knowing a decision made in error will destroy everyone involved. He transmitted not the data of the error, but the feeling of the failure, seeking to destabilize the Ky'lar's inherent confidence in her species' perfect math. The goal was simple: force a full system abort, or cause a soft reset by drowning the system in irrationality, diverting the energy intended for the jump into stabilizing the neurological feedback loop. REC 00421. The Ky'lar's desperation was palpable. In the shared mental space, she visualized the connection as a cancerous growth emerging from the core jump drive. She tried to sever the link with a catastrophic psychic shockwave, an attempt to jettison Silas's consciousness entirely, potentially frying his physical brain. The surge was immense. For Silas, the experience was the complete physical realization of sleep paralysis being weaponized, 100 invisible hands holding him down, pressing the air out of his lungs, filling his auditory field with a low-frequency rumble that felt like seismic activity. The dilapidated basement room shuddered violently. Dust rained down from the ceiling rafters, visible only because the residual energy, now crackling around the rusted chair, caused the air particles to momentarily glow neon blue. Silas fought the physical inertia. He could not move his physical body, but he could redirect the energy of her attack. Instead of allowing the severance, he utilized the shockwave's energy, routing it through the chaotic memories, turning her attempt at deletion into a massive data feedback loop, essentially infecting the alien's own central processing unit with her own defense mechanism. The holographic countdown hit 003. The moment of maximum structural failure was now. Silas saw the fatal vulnerability of the 3-eye atlas not as a mathematical flaw, but as a deliberate absence, a structural weakness built into the core design, perhaps as a failsafe, or perhaps as a necessary gap for non-Euclidean travel. His chaotic injection had found this gap, and now the entire ship visualization was collapsing inward, the geometry folding upon itself like crumpled paper. He realized the corruption was tied not just to the jump sequence, but to the Ky'lar's own neurological structure, which served as the living processor for the ship. By poisoning the navigator, he was physically poisoning the vessel. The Ky'lar in the basement reacted physically, her long neck bending sharply backward, an action that seemed impossible given human physiology. A high-pitched harmonic whine emanated from her suit's sternum ports, now visibly vibrating and flashing red, an indicator of system overload and severe physiological distress. The pale bronze sheen of her skin seemed to dim and flicker, as if her entire biological energy signature was failing under the foreign computational load. 0001. The jump sequence initiated. Instead of the smooth, instantaneous shift the Ky'lar intended, the result was a brutal, physical detonation of psychic energy. In the basement, the overhead bare light bulb exploded, showering the room in harmless glass and plunging the camera view into infrared night vision, amplifying the grainy, low-res quality. Silas felt the universe turn inside out. This was not a jump. It was a violent derailment. He tasted copper and felt liquid warmth behind his eyes. The Ky'lar was directly mirroring the catastrophic feedback. She staggered back 2 steps, her body shaking with tremors that were too rapid to be muscular, resembling the vibration of a tuning fork. She gripped her own elongated neck with both hands, trying to suppress the neural feedback loop that Silas had successfully engineered. He had overloaded her capacity for structured thought, replacing it with the fear of random, meaningless death. The sound of tearing metal, not in the basement, but resonating through the psychic link from the failing structure of the 3-eye atlas, reached his ears. The catastrophic counter-injection had worked. The ship was no longer navigating. It was fracturing. The astral connection, once a hyper-organized network of structured light, ripped open like wet paper. Silas's projected form, now merely a shell for the injection of raw, unfiltered human suffering and mundane data, was being violently shunted outwards. The Ky'lar initiated the jettison protocol, a desperate automated response designed to jettison corrupt calculations. But the corruption wasn't just data, it was consciousness. The internal visual architecture of the Ky'lar's calculus, appearing as impossibly tall, shimmering silver lattices, began to warp and buckle, screaming in a frequency that translated only as pure agonizing pressure within Silas's mind. The persistent REC000501 overlay flickered wildly as the camera in the basement room rattled on its makeshift stand. T-minus 5 seconds until jump. The Ky'lar, in her astral projection, recoiled, hands flying up not to attack, but to attempt to seal the existential breach in her own psychic integrity. She was realizing the horror. The chaotic data was not merely being rejected, it was replicating within her core operational matrix, causing systemic, terminal failure. Silas felt a moment of cold, abstract triumph. The mission was successful, but the cost was the total dissolution of his own conscious self. The boundary between the rusty basement and the iridescent alien calculation space thinned to nothing, resulting in a blinding, agonizing overlap. The feedback loop peaked. Silas's physical body in the chair went rigid, his fingers twitching against the useless restraints. Inside the interface, the Ky'lar emitted a final, terrifying astral shriek. A pure waveform of panic that sounded like every radio station playing simultaneously through shattered speakers. The iridescent bronze of her projected skin seemed to dull and crack under the impossible pressure of compressed human history. The large, purple-reflecting almond eyes focused on Silas's fragmented projection with cold, absolute malice, mixed with terror. She wasn't just trying to jettison him, she was attempting to physically atomize the invading presence. The force applied was so intense that the VHS tracking lines at the top of the frame broke entirely, obscuring the REC 00514 overlay momentarily. On the basement floor, dust motes suddenly levitated due to the low-frequency resonance caused by the astral rupture. Silas tasted metal, the physical consequence of his brain being overloaded with the foreign, violent energy of the rejection. His modified goggles, still feeding data back into the failing recorder, began to whine, the IR sensors struggling against the rapidly changing energy signatures. The structural dissolution was now causing physical rupture in the shared space. The basement shuddered, a deep, grinding sound that was unmistakably structural failure, not just electrical. The rusted metal chair Silas was strapped into groaned and shifted, one leg buckling slightly against the uneven concrete floor. The external camera view swung violently downward as the vibration intensified, showing only the scuffed, dirty boots of Silas and the pooling shadow beneath the chair. The REC 0532 time code blinked erratically. The Ky'lar, having failed the clean jettison, performed the final catastrophic override. A massive, uncontrolled energy pulse intended to burn out the connection at the point of origin, regardless of the consequences to the ship's jump integrity or her own physical safety. This surge manifested in the basement as a sudden, sharp explosion of localized air pressure. Silas's head snapped backward against the rusted metal frame. A thin stream of blood, dark and viscous, even through the low-fidelity lens, trickled from his left nostril. The surge was the last thing he felt astrally, a blinding, burning cold that tore his consciousness away from the calculus with the force of a cosmic tidal wave, leaving behind a smoking, ruinous wake. T-0. The countdown was over, but there was no successful jump signature. Instead, there was silence, immediate and crushing, followed by a sound like tearing silk, the sound of the astral mechanism rupturing entirely. The brief flash of light that had overwhelmed the camera lens vanished, plunging the room into near total darkness, illuminated only by the faint, flickering green indicators on Silas's modified safety goggles. The Ky'lar's biological body, which had been resting peacefully in her induced paralysis state, reacted violently to the terminal failure. A deep, guttural moan that sounded too loud for the small basement room echoed off the damp, concrete walls. The REC 000558 display briefly jumped to a solid white screen before the recording mechanism corrected itself, showing the distorted, shadowy outline of the room again. Silas's astral self slammed back into his physical shell with bone-jarring force. He gasped, a ragged, wheezing sound that tore at his throat, fighting desperately to regain control of his lungs. He was alive but shattered, tasting ozone and pulverized memory. The Ky'lar's consciousness was completely gone from the room, having either been evacuated or tragically fragmented by the self-inflicted purge. The air in the basement was thick, metallic, and hot, smelling faintly of sulfur and burnt electronics. The physical manifestation of the interface failure left visible evidence. A long, shallow crack now ran diagonally across the concrete floor, emanating from the precise location where the Ky'lar's body had rested during the exchange. The camera, still recording REC 000615, slowly settled back into a stable position, revealing the immediate aftermath. The soundproofing foam panels Silas had meticulously glued to the walls were partially peeled back near the ceiling, suggesting a powerful sonic blast. Silas was slumped forward, unsecured, his head resting on his chest, utterly depleted. The oversized gray hoodie was soaked with sweat and marked with streaks of grime. He lifted a shaky hand, pushing the heavy safety goggles back onto his forehead. His large prescription lenses, normally clear, were slightly cracked at the edge. His eyes, though unfocused, searched the room, verifying the termination. The Ky'lar's physical presence was completely absent, leaving behind only the impression pressed into the dusty floor where she had lain, a profound emptiness that confirmed the withdrawal was immediate and desperate. With agonizing slowness, Silas dragged his left hand down the side of his chest, feeling the violent tremors still coursing through his muscles. He had survived the ejection, but the sustained astral overload had rattled his nervous system beyond comprehension. His archived human memory, deployed as a chaotic weapon, had done its intended job. The 3-eye Atlas jump was scrubbed, the Ky'lar's calculus compromised, and the transmission window closed, perhaps permanently. He fumbled for the harness securing his data logger. The central hub of the operation, now buzzing faintly, but still operational. The internal drive indicator showed a massive influx of corrupted, but crucially, raw data captured during the final milliseconds of the catastrophic rupture. This was the dark net treasure he sought. Proof and the unintended side effects of a system failure too massive to ignore. He reached down to the floor, his vision swimming, and his fingers brushed against something warm, textured, and surprisingly light. He curled his hand around it and slowly pulled it into the weak light filtering from the blinking indicator on the data logger. It was a fragment of the Ky'lar suit, a sharp, dark gray piece of singed chitin that had broken off during the violent physical recoil. The low-fidelity camera focused sharply on the alien artifact for a sustained moment, the REC code 648, timestamp steadying. Silas gripped the fragment, the physical proof, a desperate grounding anchor in the dizzying reality of what had just occurred. He knew this single piece was enough to validate years of his archival work. It was the residue of the collapse. He slowly turned his head, looking directly into the lens of the recording camera. His face was pale and drawn, his receding hairline matted with sweat, the dark rings beneath his tired eyes emphasized by the harsh, low light. His breath hitched, turning into a hoarse whisper directed right at the archival lens, confirming the successful sabotage. The counter-injection, it stalled the core calculus. The Atlas didn't jump. It fractured. Data secured, archived. They know now. He paused, a fragile, triumphant smile pulling at the corner of his lips, which were cracked and dry. He lowered his hand, dropping the chitin fragment onto the floor beside the data logger. He reached for the emergency shutdown button on the logger, his final act of securing the evidence. The ambient sound of the dying electronics and his ragged breathing filled the basement. The REC 000705 timecode flashed 3 times, then vanished completely as the power source was deliberately cut, plunging the entire frame into a blinding, deafening static. The recording ended.